Hello everybody, welcome to the longest of term reviews of my Logitech MX518. This particular one I bought back in 2008 and used on and off for right up until mid-2021, at which point I decided to open it up, give it a paracord, replace the switches, and do a few other improvements. But even at that point, the mouse was still working just as well as the day I bought it. So, yeah, kind of hard to beat the reliability of this thing for me. But anyway, it's not something that I use in this form currently. I have a few, I've modded a few of the MX518 legendaries and tested them out against some of the current shapes. And I find that at the end of the day, I basically perform just as well with those modded 518s as I do with anything else I've owned. And so I thought it would still be a good idea to talk over what it is about this shape that works well for me, my history with it, and what I think it still has as unique benefits compared to the newer versions of this kind of shape on the market. So to start with, when I bought this mouse in 2008, I was a wrist aimer. I used higher sensitivity with mouse acceleration in order to give the combination of features where I could 180 by quickly flicking my wrist, but also then have slow enough sensitivity to do reasonable precision when I moved the mouse slowly. And looking back on it, the combo performed surprisingly well, although it's not something I could ever see myself returning to these days. At the time when I bought this mouse, I had been using the IntelliMouse Explorer 3.0, which is largely a similar shape to the EC1C review that I've posted if you want more information about how I interact with that mouse. At the time, I had been starting to have a bit of issues with this joint on the side of my wrist here behind my thumb, because when I'd been doing flicks, I would kind of hyperextend my wrist this way, and it started damaging the tendon here. So I bought the 518 in the hopes that this would, something about the difference in the shape, would maybe help to prevent me from injuring myself further, in addition to trying a couple other things. And it turned out that the mouse itself didn't magically fix my problems, but it did allow me to work a little bit better as a wrist aimer by extending my range of motion. And what I mean is that the shape itself being a little bit taller and more rounded, almost sort of potato-y, like the original G Pro wireless, was more conducive to pushing the mouse a little bit further forward in my grip. And this resulted in the sensor position being further out, which meant that with the same amount of wrist motion, I could move my crosshairs further. And as a consequence, I was able to play a little bit more effectively with a lower number of times that I would fling my wrist hard enough to continue injuring myself. But the other real benefit to this shape over a really wide and flat shape like the EC1 was that it offers a wide degree of flexibility in terms of how you can tilt your wrist while using the mouse. And one of the things that people who are more knowledgeable about wrist aiming may be intimately familiar with is that the more vertical your wrist is, the greater your range of motion, because your wrist can move a lot further this way than it can this way. And so if you get your wrist more cranked around like this, that will actually increase your physical range of motion. So it was kind of a mouse that I could use with, I guess, what these days would be referred to as like a pincer claw grip, where I'm really just pushing the mouse into my right side of my palm where the ring and pinky fingers are, and having my wrist very kind of cocked up to the side like this. And that was reasonably effective as a way to, again, improve the efficacy of my wrist aiming. But eventually, none of those things ever actually totally fixed my health issues. And so I converted over to being basically an arm aimer who relies very little on wrist movement these days. Anyhow, So the wrist aiming tangent aside, I will from here on out be discussing the usage of this shape as it relates to arm aiming and my current aiming style. So the feeling of using this mouse to me is in a lot of ways reminiscent of the EC1C. And I say that because of two specific features. First of all, the back of this mouse, despite being taller and more rounded than the EC1, it narrows down and extends out to quite a thin and long back end to it. If you look at mice like the G703, their humps are shorter in length relative to the rest of the buttons on the mouse, and so they don't fill up this area right at the back of my palm as much. As a consequence, when using the 518, unlike the 703, the Makalu 67, the Outset, etc., I tend to be able to do a better job of minimizing the contact the back of my palm has with the mouse pad in a similar fashion to what I described doing in the EC1 review. Additionally, the inclusion of this design element here, where there's a wide sort of ring finger ledge that is not overlapped with the right mouse button, creates a large surface area for my ring finger to rest on without having to twist the finger to the side in order to make better contact with the side of the mouse. This is a major area in which this design differs, again, from the 703, where when I hold this mouse, you'll see that the right side of my hand droops down and around, and my ring finger is actually turned more this way to try and get the bulk of my fingertip in contact with the side of the mouse for more control. Because of this ring finger ledge, I can have my ring finger knuckle up here more in a flat line rather than being drooped down around the side of the mouse. And this means that I'm able to end up with a feeling that's a little bit more reminiscent of the EC1, where my hand feels like it's sitting on top of the mouse instead of really wrapping around the sides of it. This also, to me, does a lot to explain why I still prefer the 518 to some modern takes on this shape. Probably the worst offender to my mind is the Razer Basilisk, where instead of having this ring finger ledge, they've gone and taken all of this real estate and essentially converted it into part of the right mouse button. So there's no way that I can put my ring finger towards the front of the mouse comfortably. And it just ruins the way that this shape works for me. So it's very frustrating that there's not really a true sort of successor to certain elements of this mouse's design. The other thing about the ring finger ledge in practice that works really well is it gives me a huge amount of contact area with my ring finger. And so as you can see, I'm actually able to lift and control the mouse without relying on thumb contact at all. And this has sort of carry-on benefits in terms of the way that this shape interacts with using the thumb buttons that I'll be getting to in a little bit. So overall, I think it's a very effective shape in that I can control it and lift it using my palm and thumb, or my palm and ring finger, or even my palm and pinky, right? So there's a huge level of control I can generate over this mouse using my fingers that aren't hitting the left and right mouse buttons. In terms of those buttons, for me, the left and right clicks are reminiscent of the Vaxi Outsets, and I think that's part of why I adjusted to those clicks so easily. The total travel is not particularly short, but you are able to take up a little bit of tension with the 518 and get situated right up against the actuation point of the switch. And particularly on the left click of this mouse, the switches are mounted quite far forward, which means that the click distance here is very short and snappy. This makes the MX518, despite having a similar physical button design to Zowie mice, It makes the 518 very effective for click timing and reaction-based games. And in addition, these buttons also work quite well for spam clicking. This was the mouse that I primarily used during the years where I was very into MOBAs and playing them for, well, I'll just say far too many hours a day. So if you are concerned about this mouse's ability to spam click effectively, yeah, fear no more. The thumb buttons have a little bit of their own charm, which I'm going to get back to what I said before. So the ability to control the mouse with my ring and pinky fingers very effectively and not relying on my thumb means that I'm able to use these thumb buttons in an effective manner. As you can see, they lie outside of this quite significant thumb groove, and it makes it very, very difficult for me to actuate the buttons by rolling my thumb. And so, if you've seen my reviews on the 703 and the Outset, you might assume that I would dislike these. Um, a lot of my ability to understand and employ these thumb buttons probably does relate to the fact that I used this mouse before I adjusted to either of those. But basically, what I do is I refuse to bind the thumb buttons on the 518 to any inputs I might need to use in a reactive fashion. In other words, I will only use these thumb buttons for in-game functionality that I have decided to use before the time when I'm required to use them. So they're a deliberate, conscious decision ahead of time that I'm going to be employing whatever this button does. And as a consequence, I'm able to lift and move my thumb in order to hit that switch at the correct time. And having it lifted and moved and hovering over this other button, again, does not prevent me from moving, aiming, using the mouse as I would otherwise before then actuating the thumb button. Combined with the fact that these buttons are nicely separated from each other and sufficiently rounded, I don't run into any issues of accidentally hitting one button when intending to use the other, nor do I ever accidentally hit them by rolling my thumb. And as a consequence, I'm able to assign the thumb buttons to some very, very important or valuable game commands and have no fear of utilizing them incorrectly. As far as the scroll wheel of the 518 goes, again, I find it somewhat reminiscent of the Outset because it is relatively small in diameter, but also recessed quite aggressively into the shell. And the steps are not particularly clearly defined or aggressively tactile. And so I'm not able to really use this scroll wheel in a comparable manner to that of the EC1C. But it does have one big advantage over the Outset scroll wheel in that the scroll click of the 518 is much easier to use and is much more enjoyable in its feel than the stock scroll click of the Vaxi Outset. So sort of a slight win for the 518 there. Oh, and then one other thing I forgot to mention that does add to the reminiscence between the Outset and the 518 is the lack of any comfort grooves in the buttons themselves. They are purely convex in shape. So overall, what would I say that the strengths of the 518 are? To me, it's the mouse's precision. As you can see here, I'm able to generate quite a large range of motion without adjusting the way that my palm grips onto the mouse. And as a consequence, I'm able to do a very effective job of making corrections to my aim at the end of flicks. This ability to make small movements with the mouse accurately and quickly also benefits me when doing precision-based tasks like microshot or 6-shot in AimLab, where I score very well with the 518, and the ability to make corrections very effectively also helps increase my consistency with this mouse in terms of my aiming performance. As a result, I have a high degree of confidence in my performance with this mouse, although its speed and pure reaction time is somewhat limited compared to other options on the market. In terms of final thoughts and things related to the build quality, the buttons all have a certain level of rattle to them, brand new out of the box. And this is more reflective of the mouse's history as something that was designed in the early 2000s rather than being perhaps a particular oversight on Logitech's part in manufacturing it. Things can be done with modifications to address all of this. In particular, there's a small amount of rattle on the main buttons as they have a little bit too much pre-travel, which can be addressed by simply putting some aluminum tape on the end of the button where it pushes against the switch. And I just need to find an opportunity to open this one up and fix that right click, but the left one is already nice and done. And similarly, you can use aluminum tape around the sides of these physical buttons so that they're not able to wobble inside the holes that they reside in so easily. So you can improve the QC of this mouse up to a fairly high standard, but it does become a relatively fiddly and slightly sort of like painting model figurines-esque tinkering sort of task to get it all perfect. In terms of, how it stacks up against current offerings on the market, again, unless you're going to go through the process of extensively modifying a current 518 Legendary yourself, I don't really see it as being a premium competitor because it's simply too heavy. But I would probably opt for a 518 Legendary over a Death Adder V2, a G305, a G203, anything in kind of the $30 price range, because to me, the benefits of this shape and my familiarity with it far outweigh any weight benefits from a significantly less comfortable shape like the other options that I mentioned. Of course, the Logitech 403, G403, starts to get down into that price range as well. So it's hard to argue that I would take an out-of-the-box 518 Legendary over an out-of-the-box 403, but they're also not a million miles apart from each other either. Anyway, guys, that about does it for my thoughts on the 518. Hopefully that has helped inform your understanding of kind of what this shape does and why it continues to remain in my collection despite so many years having passed and so many new designs being available which do largely imitate its shape. If you have any questions left, please let me know in the comments. I'd be happy to answer them. Other than that, thank you so much for watching. Please do leave a like on the video if you enjoyed it, and I will be back tomorrow with a long-term review on the Mountain Kalu 67.